The southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, surrounded by some of the most oil-rich countries in the world, is Yemen. Home to the city of Aden, which during World War II was the world's busiest port city after New York, due to its strategic location on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait that is the gateway to the Suez Canal. At that time, $700 billion worth of trade passed through this strait. However, despite this unique geographic advantage, today, Yemen is facing one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters, with almost the entire population relying on humanitarian aid. Since 2015, Yemen has become a proxy war for two major regional powers in the Middle East, Iran and Saudi Arabia, who have fueled Yemen's now 10-year-long civil war. The conflict between the Iranian-backed Houthis and the Saudi-backed internationally recognized government, or IRG for short, has led to the collapse of the Yemeni rial's exchange rate, with sharp fluctuations in the currency's circulation, soaring inflation, and escalating social unrest. These conditions have severely crippled economic sectors across the country, with Yemenis increasingly holding both sides responsible. Between the beginning of the civil war in 2015 up until 2023, Yemen's real GDP per capita has fallen by over 50%, resulting in more than 4 out of 5 Yemenis living in poverty and half of the population facing food insecurity. Prior to the civil war, Yemen already had a very struggling economy that was mired by prior civil wars and a difficult relationship with its neighbors that left the country with a high poverty rate and low human capital, as evidenced by the decline in Yemen's score on the Human Development Index. As of 2022, it ranked 186 out of 191 countries. To understand the roots of Yemen's seemingly unending instability, we need to understand where it comes from. Let's take it back to early modern history. All of Yemen used to be under the Ottoman Empire. After its fall, the northern part came under the rule of the Mutawakkilite Kingdom, while the southern part became a British protectorate. In 1962, North Yemen overthrew its monarchy and became a republic, while South Yemen gained independence just 5 years later and adopted communism. These two states became the Arabian Peninsula's first and only republics, though they developed starkly opposing ideologies. These ideological divides manifested in sharply contrasting economic systems. In the communist South, the government centralized control over resources, nationalizing industries like fisheries and oil while collectivizing agriculture. Foreign investment was restricted, and trade ties leaned heavily towards socialist allies like the Soviet Union and China, while North Yemen retained a mixed economy, blending tribal agrarian traditions with limited privatization. After decades of separation, North and South Yemen unified in 1990 under a single republic. However, the union collapsed within a year, plunging the country into civil war after political assassinations and ideological clashes reignited tensions. The 2011 Arab Spring reignited political upheaval, leading to a UN-sponsored national dialogue in 2013 that proposed dividing Yemen into 6 federal regions, but this plan was rejected by both northern and southern separatists. At this point, it was becoming increasingly clear to the international community that Yemen was going to be a difficult nation to stabilize. In 2014, the majority Shia Zaidi population formed the Houthi group, which fought against the central government and established the Houthi Revolutionary Committee, effectively replacing the IRG and forcing it to relocate to the southern city of Aden. The Houthis tightened their grip on the country and resorted to extreme measures when challenged, including shelling the president's private residence and placing him under house arrest. Then, in 2015, a third faction, the Southern Transitional Council, broke away from the central government. Meanwhile, the nephew of former President Ali Abdullah Saleh led his own faction, which took control of much of Yemen's western coast. But then in 2020, all three merged again, creating the Presidential Leadership Council, which today is what we refer to as the IRG, supported by a coalition of nations led by Saudi Arabia. Despite all this, the most pressing issue facing Yemen isn't its political and military instability, but rather its failing economy. War, or even any form of instability in general, always has a devastating effect on countries' economies, and Yemen is no exception. In the first year of the war alone, economic output fell by an estimated 28%. The conflict has intensified the country's fragmentation into two distinct economic zones, each governed by its unique set of institutions. These include competing monetary and legal authorities, resulting in increasing disparities in all aspects of life. Houthi-controlled areas are home to some 70% of the population and account for around half of the GDP, while IRG-controlled areas hold the majority of the country's oil and gas resources. In Houthi-controlled areas, only pre-war banknotes are in use, while in parts of the country under the government's control, new bills printed since 2016 are prevalent. This division became an acute economic issue when the Houthis banned the new notes in December 2019. This makes sense when you consider that recently the IRG printed 6 trillion rials, which unsurprisingly caused the rial to lose 80% of its value since 2014, while it remained relatively stable in Houthi-controlled areas. The price of basic goods has skyrocketed in government-controlled areas, while wages, when they are even paid out, have remained stagnant. In Houthi-controlled areas, meanwhile, public salaries haven't been paid regularly in years, and fuel prices have soared amid shortages and a dispute between the Houthis and the government over imports to the Red Sea port of Hodeidah. To say that Yemen is going through hardships would be an understatement. But what makes this so surprising is that Yemen is surrounded by some of the most oil-rich countries in the world, known for their flamboyant, wealthy lifestyle. Yemen, too, is sitting on a massive gold mine of 3 billion barrels of crude oil and 17 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Still, despite making up the majority of government revenues, Yemen produces drastically less oil than its neighbours and much less than it's capable of. Production has been declining since 2002 and currently hovers between 7,000 and 10,000 barrels per day, a stark contrast to the peak of 450,000 barrels per day in 2001. For comparison, its neighbouring country, Oman, produced approximately 800,000 barrels per day in 2023. Constant instability meant that Yemen was never fully able to exploit its natural resource wealth and is extremely reliant on the little bit that it is able to exploit. This is also why international companies are hesitant to invest in Yemen. Foreign direct investment, FDI, has been limited in recent years, with a steady decline since 2008. In 2023, the Houthis attempted to blockade the IRG from international oil markets with drone and missile attacks on IRG oil facilities. The IRG's oil revenue dropped significantly, which led to government revenue dropping by 30%. In turn, the government severely reduced its spending across all sectors. This all came together to explain a 23.7% drop in nominal GDP per capita, which really demonstrates the country's immense dependence on this scarce resource. Another major reason for the decline of Yemen's oil sector is rampant corruption, which has plagued the country for years. In 2023, Yemen ranked 176th out of 180 countries on the Corruption Perceptions Index, highlighting the severity of the issue. Growth in the oil sector depends on Yemen's ability to attract foreign investment, especially given its aging oil fields, which needs substantial investment and that remains contingent on improving security and achieving peace. Non-oil activity continues to be constrained by interruptions in essential service delivery, acute input shortages across industries, double taxation, market distortions from uncoordinated policies, and not to mention the conflict itself. Undoubtedly, corruption within the IRG and Aden is a major contributing factor to the impoverishment of Yemenis and the collapse of the country's economy, services, and currency. The IRG has exploited the country's resources to advance its political and military interests. rather than reforming service institutions that directly impact citizens' lives. It has also consistently squandered opportunities to improve humanitarian conditions in areas under its control. However, this corruption is not exclusive to the IRG. The Houthis are similarly engaged in corrupt practices. The Houthis have also been accused of obstructing humanitarian assistance and imposing heavy taxes on goods entering their territory, including on fuel, which has led to additional price increases. In 2015, to support the IRG, the Saudi-led coalition launched a blockade on Houthi-controlled territory. A blockade is a military operation that prevents the movement of people, goods, or communications into or out of a country or region. For more than 7 years, as a method of war, the coalition has restricted the maritime imports of fuel, food, medicine, and other essential goods to Houthi-controlled territory. In a country that imports 90% of what it consumes, the restrictions placed on imports fuel the inflation in the country. The government data shows inflation in Yemen at around 12%. Unofficial sources suggest an increase of 200 to 500%. The Houthis recently did the same to the IRG, targeting their oil industry, which caused the aforementioned problems with IRG government revenues. The problem with inflation is that it directly harms society and families. Rising prices impact wages and salaries, often leading to halted production, worker strikes, and disruptions in education. The collapse of the local currency and financial system has further worsened inflation over the past decade. It has reached a point where society is deeply divided. While some exploit opportunities to grow wealthy through smuggling, others struggle to afford even a loaf of bread. Considering the rash and spontaneous decision-making nature of the IRG and Houthi wartime governments, we can expect that inflation won't be kept tame anytime in the near future. As foreign investors lost faith in the economy, they withdrew capital, further devaluing the local currency. Yemen's foreign exchange reserves have shrunk significantly, making it difficult for the government to support the currency even if it tried. Excessive money printing, coupled with foreign currency outflows due to an unstable investment environment, has further weakened the currency. In a country heavily reliant on imports, this has directly caused a spike in inflation. As a result of the blockades on Yemen, the humanitarian situation for the civil population has been dire. Since the economic blockade imposed by the coalition, more than 131,000 people have died due to a lack of food, limited access to healthcare, and deteriorating infrastructure. According to the World Food Programme, 19 million Yemenis were food insecure, 3.5 million acutely malnourished, and 161,000 are in famine-like conditions. Yemen's cataclysmic humanitarian situation is entirely man-made and preventable. Parties to the conflict have relied on methods of warfare targeting the country's fragile economy, leading to its collapse. Overall, Yemen never achieved the stability needed to focus on development, and economic growth remains impossible without it. Arguably, the most promising period in modern Yemeni history was in 1997, when the government collaborated with the IMF, which significantly increased Yemen's credit availability in exchange for market reforms. These included eliminating subsidies, reducing defense spending, privatizing industries, and introducing new taxes. In theory, these measures should have boosted confidence in the government's fiscal responsibility, improved its ability to repay debt, and created an investment-friendly environment. However, their impact on Yemen's economy was minimal, and by 2001, the IMF suspended the program. The reality was that, although the government appeared to be implementing positive market reforms suggested by the IMF, high-ranking officials had been dividing the country's land and resources among themselves since the end of the 1994 civil war. Families with government ties were awarded lucrative contracts, and monopolies were established in key industries such as real estate, oil, and construction. As the government increasingly cut subsidies and reduced the public sector, the country's largest employer, the already struggling and marginalized low and middle-class populations rose in anger. By 2010, subsidies accounted for nearly a fifth of the government's budget, and their removal effectively severed the public's access to the oil wealth that constituted the majority of government income. Meanwhile, the country's elite continued to benefit from corruption. Yemen is a prime example of how good economic policies require good governance and stability to be effective. Even if a country offers attractive investment policies, low taxes, and minimal regulations, it will fail to attract investment without strong rule of law and political stability. As long as Yemen remains a battleground for regional powers, there is no hope for its people. However, if by some chance peace is achieved and Yemen is able to stabilize itself for some period, it has a lot of potential. Even the removal of the blockade, sanctions, unnecessary taxes, and the increased confidence of peace would be a huge relief for a people that have been struggling with decades of hardship.